How sweet the sound! Oh, welcome again to Art of Poetry. And today is a blockbuster. I'm so glad to welcome Bill and his ensemble from Key West. Can you believe it? Oh, it's just wonderful to have your ensemble who've prepared a show, and I'm here to enjoy to the fullest your work with Elizabeth Bishop, one of my favorite poets. So, we are good to go. We look forward to learning a lot today, as my neighbors want. We have 9 towns here listening in on you, so give us your best shot.
Oh, we will. If we can, we will.
You will.
Hello.
You're on, Bill.
Okay. Hello and welcome to Readings of Poems by Elizabeth Bishop. I'm Bill McCarthy, a member of the Elizabeth Bishop Key West Committee and organizer of this program. The Elizabeth Bishop Key West Committee was formed to highlight the role Key West played in the life of a now highly acclaimed American poet. Our readers, the other members of the committee, are Kay Bierweiler.
Greetings.
Roseanne Potter. I hope you can be seen there.
You can't see me? Oh, well.
Yes, there you are.
I'm here.
Mia Schmidt.
Hello.
Let's get a proper view of you. I'm not doing it. And Malcolm Willison. I call Malcolm the founder of the feast, for he is the one who patiently explained to the Key West authorities that in Elizabeth Bishop they have a major writer who lived here. It's not all Ernest Hemingway. So, thanks to Malcolm's efforts, each year since 2019, the Mayor and City Council of Key West have proclaimed February 8, Bishop's birthday, Elizabeth Bishop Day in Key West. And the body that organizes the Key West Literary Seminar has bought the house Bishop lived in and is restoring it. We've chosen 13 poems from across Bishop's career and read them only roughly in order of publication. Malcolm will get us started with a short bio, and then we're off to the readings. Malcolm, it's you.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks. And thanks to the Valley Shore Community TV for having us from Key West. But why read Elizabeth Bishop's poetry? Well, of course, she is now considered one of the great poets in English of at least the last 70 years. Bishop is known for how precise her poems are, of carefully chosen, elusive and allusive words. She's telling us her own experiences, her own questions, and her own answers. And what was that experience? Born in 1911, in Massachusetts, her father soon died, and her mother was institutionalized permanently when she was 5. As an orphan, little Elizabeth was taken from her mother's much adored family in their Nova Scotia village by her father's wealthy family, who took her to Massachusetts, where she almost died of emotional neglect, bronchitis, eczema, and asthma, which plagued her the rest of her life. Sent to an aunt in a meager Boston suburb, Elizabeth seldom went to school, but was often sick in bed, and with her aunt sang hymns and read the Bible, along with Shakespeare, the Jacobean poets of the 17th century, and the 19th century standards, Keats and all the rest of them. She escaped to summer sailing camp and then a girls' boarding school, where she began to write including a poem we'll be reading. In 1934, she went to Bohemian Greenwich Village from Vassar College, which had provided sophistication and practice in literature, music, and art. She was also a painter, by the way, occasionally. But in New York City, she was miserable. Luckily, she had already wrangled a meeting with Marianne Moore, the modernist poet and eccentric, who appreciated and critiqued Bishop's poems. Bishop escaped New York for mostly Key West, where she fished, drank, wrote, and with her partner bought a much-loved old house. This is very much like Hemingway's Key West experience, especially the drinking. When World War II brought in the Navy, Bishop moved into a new partner's quieter place. Severely critical of her own work, however, she suffered from loneliness, depression, asthma, and alcohol. But eventually, she completed enough poems to publish at a late 35 her first book, the most critically acclaimed North and South in 1946, and she left Key West. When she met Robert Lowell, U.S. poetry's then rising star, they became each other's only lifelong poet confidant. He got her nominated, reluctantly, for his post as annual U.S. Poet Laureate and steered her to grants and awards. Now she could take her long-delayed trip by boat around South America. She too had red wing mansions, but she got no farther than Brazil, where she discovered she was dangerously allergic to cashew fruit, not the nut, but the fruit, which she'd never seen before, and fell in love with her hostess and caretaker, Lota de Macedo Soares, a well-connected landscape architect who provided her with her longest residence anywhere, 15 years in Brazil. Her partner's oncoming nervous breakdown and eventual suicide led Bishop to reluctantly take up U.S. university teaching for her last decade and a half, culminating as a successful teacher of poetry at Harvard, thanks to Lowell, again, who died a year before Bishop herself did in 1979, quite suddenly. We will be reading poems from all these periods of her life, especially the Elegy to Lowell and the summation of her many losses by Roseanne. Bishop, like us all, was a mass of contradictions. Despite her self-doubt, ailments, and alcoholic depression, she was charming and fun if she felt comfortable with you. She scorned the conventional, though she used it as a useful disguise just as an ordinary person. She detested the narrow-minded, the pushy, and the snobbish, and appreciated good manners and careful craft, regardless of class. She wasn't heterosexual, and even poetry in those days was mostly a man's world. A bohemian among ordinary people, she faced obstacles and survived through her poetry. As for that poetry, it's informal, even conversational, and sometimes funny. She uses ordinary language and often common situations, sometimes in conventional poetic forms even. And she has a strong sense of rhythm, as you will hear. Listen carefully to Bishop's poems here. Every word has its job to do. We hope you enjoy the ones we read, and will find many others. Good reading, and now good listening. The first poem is read by Roseanne.
Hello. I am going to read a poem that is highly anthologized, a poem that, because it was highly anthologized, Bishop got real tired of. However, it's still a good poem, and part of the fun of the poem is that it's very different from a Hemingway take on the experience, which is fishing. It's called The Fish. I caught a tremendous fish and held him beside the boat, half out of the water with my hook fast in the corner of his mouth. He didn't fight. He hadn't fought at all. He hung a grunting weight, battered and venerable and homely. Here and there, his brown skin hung in strips like ancient wallpaper, and its pattern of darker brown was like wallpaper, shapes like full-blown roses, a pattern of, stained and lost through age. He was speckled with barnacles, fine rosettes of lime, and infested with tiny sea lice. And underneath, 2 or 3 rags of green weed hung down. While his gills were breathing in the terrible oxygen, the frightening gills, fresh and crisp with blood that can cut so easily, I thought of the coarse white flesh packed in like feathers, the big bones and the little bones, the dramatic reds and blacks of his shiny entrails, and the pink swim bladder like a big peony. I looked into his eyes, which were far larger than mine, but shallower and yellowed, the irises backed and packed with tarnished tinfoil seen through the lenses of old scratched isinglass. They shifted a little, but not to return my stare. It was more like the tipping of an object toward the light. I admired his sullen face, the mechanism of his jaw. Then I saw, grim, wet, and weapon-like, hung 5 old pieces of fish line. I'm sorry, I skipped a line. Then I saw that from his lower lip, if you could call it a lip, grim, wet, and weapon-like, hung 5 old pieces of fish line, or 4, and a wire leader with a swivel still attached, with all their fine big hooks grown firmly in his mouth. A green line frayed at the end where he broke it, and 2 heavier lines and a fine black thread, still crimped from the strain and snap when it broke and he got away. Like medals with their ribbons frayed and wavering, a 5-haired beard of wisdom trailed from his aching jaw. I stared and stared, and victory filled up the little rented boat. From the pool of bilge where oil had spread a rainbow around the rusted engine, to the bailer rusted orange, the sun-cracked thwarts, the oarlocks with their strings, on their strings, the gunnels, until everything was rainbow, rainbow, rainbow. And I let the fish go. Not what Hemingway.
Right. Not the Hemingway. Oh, thank you, Roseanne. And notice the detail. It's so descriptive, and yet it's all analogous. You're hearing echoes of a wider meaning to all of this, to her, very clearly. The poem I'm going to read is the first one of hers that was ever published. It was published in her boarding school literary thing, journal, and it was written in 1928. And it's about her childhood in Nova Scotia. She went to the elementary, pre-elementary school in Nova Scotia, in the Great Village, as it was called. And she was fascinated, since this was really a one-room schoolhouse in some sense. The upper classes were getting map work. The maps would be pulled down, and Bishop would be sitting in her little desk and looking at these maps. And this is called The Map. Land lies in water. It is shadowed green. Shadows, or are they shallows, at its edges, showing the line of long, sea-weeded ledges where weeds hang to the simple blue from green? Or does the land lean down to lift the sea from under, drawing it unperturbed around itself? Along the fine tan sandy shelf is the land tugging at the sea from under? The shadow of Newfoundland lies flat and still. Labrador's yellow, where the moony Eskimo has oiled it. We can stroke these lovely bays under a glass as if they were expected to blossom, or as if to provide a clean cage for invisible fish. The names of seashore towns run out to sea. The names of cities cross the neighboring mountains. The printer here experiencing the same excitement as when in motion too far exceeds its cause. These peninsulas take the water between thumb and forefinger like a woman feeling for the smoothness of yard goods. Mapped waters are more quiet than the land is, including the land, lending the land their waves' own conformation. And Norway's hair runs down south in agitation. Profiles investigate the sea where land is. Are they assigned? Or can the countries pick their colors? What suits the character of the native waters best? Topography displays no favorites. North as neat, as near as west, more delicate than the historians are the mapmakers' colors.
Pretty sophisticated poem for a, 17-year-old?
16.
And we move on to a little exercise, Mia. Yes, I have to. There you are, up top there.
Hello, again, I'm Mia, and the next two poems that I will be reading are poems written about Key West. The first is Little Exercise, and a little intro on Little Exercise. The poem Little Exercise, Elizabeth dedicated to her lifelong eccentric friend, Thomas Edwards Wanning. Tom appeared in Key West in the mid-1930s from a well-to-do family up north. He possessed, shall we say, an irreverent attitude toward traditional social mores. A favorite guest at Pauline Hemingway's parties, during one such party, he was delegated to make the rum punch. When the guests noticed they were feeling no alcoholic effect, Pauline asked Tom which bottle he had used to spike the punch. Tom pointed to the bottle, and Pauline, a devout Catholic, exclaimed, "Tommy, you put in the holy water." Little exercise for Thomas Edwards Wanning. Think of the storm roaming the sky uneasily like a dog looking for a place to sleep in. Listen to it growling. Think how they must look now, the mangrove keys lying out there unresponsive to the lightning in dark, coarse-fibered families, where occasionally a heron may undo his head, shake up his feathers, make an uncertain comment when the surrounding water shines. Think of the boulevard and the little palm trees all stuck in rows, suddenly revealed as fistfuls of limp fish skeletons. It is raining there. The boulevard and its broken sidewalks, with weeds in every crack, are relieved to be wet, the sea to be freshened. Now the storm goes away in a series of small, badly lit battle scenes, each in another part of the field. Think of someone sleeping in the bottom of a rowboat tied to a mangrove root or the pile of a bridge. Think of him as uninjured, barely disturbed. Actually, as Tom was with life.
I really think we want to think also of the picture of Key West that emerges. It is of the same Key West that we live in now. A storm today looks and sounds just like what she described.
Absolutely. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. The boulevard. Yes.
And the boulevard it still has
Yes.
And the roving.
little trees have gotten bigger, but you know, it is Key West, absolutely Key West.
Yes, it is.
Not just a lesson for him, it's a picture.
And also about Key West and our lovely waters surrounding the island. The next poem is Seascape. Bishop's poem Seascape has been described as one of her greatest Key West poems. As noted beautifully in Thomas Trevisano's book, Love Unknown, The Life and Worlds of Elizabeth Bishop, in Seascape, her representation flickers back and forth between actual things, herons or fish or mangrove roots, and opposing theological notions on concepts such as heaven or hell. Seascape. This celestial seascape, with white herons got up as angels, flying as high as they want and as far as they want, sideways in tiers and tiers of immaculate reflections. The whole region, from the highest heron down to the weightless mangrove island, with bright green leaves edged neatly with bird droppings, like illumination in silver, and down to the suggestively Gothic arches of the mangrove roots and the beautiful pea green back pasture, where occasionally a fish jumps like a wild flower in an ornamental spray of sprays. This cartoon by Raphael for a tapestry for a pope, it does look like heaven. But a skeletal lighthouse standing there in black and white clerical dress, who lives on his nerves, thinks he knows better. He thinks that hell rages below his iron feet, and that this is why the shallow water is so warm, and he knows that heaven is not like this. Heaven is not like flying or swimming, but has something to do with blackness and a strong glare, and when it gets dark, he will remember something strongly worded to say on the subject.
That figure at the end of the poem, I presume, is Sand Key Light or some similar lighthouse. Old rusty metal structures which straddle the reef and do look rather forbidding.
And again, the waters are so shallow here that the lighthouses, I believe, are actually not built on platforms, but actually down, into the substrate of the sea.
Right under the coral.
Yeah,
probably.
Yes. And that particular lighthouse is a very, very skeletal structure.
It is indeed.
So.
And by the way, it'll come up later in another poem that you are going to read, Mia. The lighthouse image is very strong.
Absolutely, another strong lighthouse image. Our next reader is Kay, who will be reading Arrival at Santos.
Take us to Brazil.
After New York City and the hustle and bustle, Elizabeth Bishop decided that she would circumnavigate the South African continent. Her first stop was at Santos, and the poem was called Arrival in Santos. Here is a coast, here is a harbor. Here, after a meager diet of horizon, is some scenery, and practically shaped, and who knows, self-pitying mountains, sad and harsh beneath the frivolous greenery, with a little church on top of one, and warehouses, some of them painted a feeble pink or blue, and some tall, uncertain palms. Oh, tourists, is this how this country is going to answer you and your immodest demands for a different world and a better life, and complete comprehension of both at last and immediately after 18 days of suspension? Finish your breakfast. The tender is coming, a strange and ancient craft flying a strange and brilliant rag. So that's the flag. I never saw it before. I somehow never thought of there being a flag. But of course there was all along. And coins, I presume the paper money, they remain to be seen. And gingerly now we climb down the ladder, backward, myself and a fellow passenger, Miss Breen, descending into the midst of 26 freighters, waiting to be loaded with green coffee beans. Please, boy, do be careful with that boat hook. Watch out. Oh, it has caught Miss Breen's skirt. There. Miss Breen is about 70, a retired police lieutenant, 6 feet tall, with beautiful, bright blue eyes and a kind expression. Her home, when she is at home, is in Glen Falls, New York. There, we are settled. The customs officers will speak English, we hope, and leave us our bourbon and cigarettes. Ports are necessities like postage stamps or soap, but they seldom seem to care what impression they make, or like this, only attempt, since it does not matter the unassertive colors of soap or postage stamps, wasting away like the former, slipping away the latter do when we mail the letters we wrote on the boat, either because the glue here is very inferior or because of the heat. We leave Santos at once. We are driving into the interior.
Wow.
Fascinating. Thanks. Thanks for reading it again. Okay. That's a poem, of course, arriving in Brazil. Santos is the port for Sao Paulo. And Bishop then went on from there to Rio to meet friends, and that's where she got so sick. Staying as she then did after that with Lota, her new partner, she began to recapitulate her past and found it very easy to, much easier there, to write about Nova Scotia. So the poem I'm going to read is a sestina, by the way, which means that at the end of each line, there's a word, and that word reappears in the next stanza. All of the stanzas have the same end words in a different order. So you don't have to watch for it if that's not the point, but she used the form. Sestina is about Nova Scotia, you'll see. September rain falls on the house. In the failing light, the old grandmother sits in the kitchen with the child beside the little marble stove, reading the jokes from the almanac, laughing and talking to hide her tears. She thinks that her equinoctial tears and the rain that beats on the roof of the house were both foretold by the almanac, but only known to a grandmother. The iron kettle sings on the stove. She cuts some bread and says to the child, "Ah, it's time for tea now." But the child is watching the tea kettle's small, hard tears dance like mad on the hot black stove, the way the rain must dance on the house. Tidying up, the old grandmother hangs up the clever almanac. On its string, bird-like, the almanac hovers half open above the child, and her teacup full, hovers above the old grandmother, excuse me, and her teacup full of dark brown tears. She shivers and says she thinks the house feels chilly and puts more wood on the stove. It was to be, says the marble stove. I know what I know, says the almanac. With crayons, the child draws a rigid house and a winding pathway. Then the child puts a man in a man with buttons like tears and shows it proudly to the grandmother. But secretly, while the grandmother busies herself about the stove, the little moons fall down like stars from between the pages of the almanac into the flower bed the child has carefully placed in the front of the house. Time to plant tears, says the almanac. The grandmother sings to the marvelous stove, and the child draws another inscrutable house. That was written about Nova Scotia from Brazil. The phrases, it was to be, and I know what I know, were actually her grandmother's. That's what her grandmother used to say. And Bishop remembers a kid, tiny kid, wondering, well, what is it she knew? And she never found out.
I know.
Who's next? The shampoo from Ted, the Brazil poem.
Thank you, Malcolm. We're back to Brazil, and this is a poem called The Shampoo, and it is about Elizabeth's lover, Lotta. The Shampoo. The still explosion on the rocks, the lichens grow by spreading gray concentric shocks. They have arranged to meet the rings around the moon, although within our memories, they have not changed. And since the heavens will long attend, as long on us you've been, dear friend, precipitate and pragmatical. And look what happens, for time is nothing, if not amenable. The shooting stars in your black hair in bright formation are flocking where? So straight, so soon. Come, let me wash it in this big basin, battered and shiny like the moon.
What's fascinating about this poem to me is that the New Yorker found it too explicit to publish. They were very fast on the subject of lesbian love. I think many people would read this poem and not realize that this is a lover washing the hair of a lover. But I guess they knew who she was staying with. They recognized the house, the way she describes the water, etc., the cliff. So they put two and two together. But I don't know that the readers of the New Yorker would have done.
I doubt it.
They knew what they knew.
Very good. The almanac knew.
Yes. Late in
The
life,
next one is
Bishop wrote about events and places she remembered from many years before. We are going from Brazil back to not even Nova Scotia, earlier than Nova Scotia. They are some of her best poems. I had a hard time deciding between the one I'm about to read and The Moose, which remembers an event on a bus trip when she was 35. In this one, the one I'm about to read, she remembers a moment from her young childhood when she was not quite 7. The poem is titled In the Waiting Room. In Worcester, Massachusetts, I went with Aunt Consuelo to keep her dentist's appointment and sat and waited for her in the dentist's waiting room. It was winter. It got dark early. The waiting room was full of grown-up people, Arctics and overcoats, lamps and magazines. My aunt was inside what seemed like a long time, and while I waited, I read the National Geographic. I could read, and carefully studied the photographs. The inside of a volcano, black and full of ashes. Then it was spilling over in rivulets of fire. Osa and Martin Johnson, dressed in riding breeches, laced boots, and pith helmets. A dead man slung on a pole, long pig, the caption said. Babies with pointed heads wound round and round with string. Black, naked women with necks wound round and round with wire like the necks of light bulbs. Their breasts were horrifying. I read it right straight through. I was too shy to stop. And then I looked at the cover, the yellow margins, the date. Suddenly, from inside, came an "oh" of pain and Consuelo's voice, not very loud or long. I wasn't at all surprised. Even then, I knew she was a foolish, timid woman. I might have been embarrassed, but wasn't. What took me completely by surprise was that it was me, my voice in my mouth. Without thinking at all, I was my foolish aunt. We were falling, our eyes glued to the cover of the National Geographic, February 1918. I said to myself, 3 days and you'll be 7 years old. I was saying it to stop the sensation of falling off the round, turning world into cold, blue-black space. But I felt, you are an I. You are an Elizabeth. You are one of them. Why should you be one too? I scarcely dared to look to see what it was I was. I gave a sidelong glance, I couldn't look any higher, at shadowy gray knees, trousers and skirts and boots and different pairs of hands lying under the lamps. I knew that nothing stranger had ever happened, that nothing stranger could ever happen. Why should I be my aunt, or me, or anyone? What similarities? Boots, hands, the family voice I felt in my throat, or even the National Geographic and those awful hanging breasts held us all together or made us all just one. How, I didn't know any word for it, how unlikely, how had I come to be here like them and overhear a cry of pain that could have got loud and worse but hadn't? The waiting room was bright and too hot. It was sliding beneath a big black wave, another and another. Then I was back in it. The war was on outside in Worcester, Massachusetts, where night and slush and cold. And it was still the 5th of February, 1918. The thing about that, well, there are things about that poem, but one of the things about that poem that just knocks me back is that, and this is technique, the first sentence, if you wrote it as prose, would be prose. It'd be good prose. It would be prose. In Worcester, Massachusetts, I went with Aunt Consuelo to keep her dentist's appointment and sat and waited for her in the dentist's waiting room. There you have it, a single sentence. You write it as verse, you have 3 beat lines, and by God, you've got verse. You've got accentual verse. 3 beat lines, the number of syllables change from one line to another. It's not consistent. This is not accentual syllabic verse. It is just accentual verse. 3 emphasized beats in a line, or syllables in a line. In Worcester, Massachusetts, I went with Aunt Consuelo, and so on. It's a technical achievement. It's a great poem, very, very powerful. I find the more I read it, the more it strikes me. And I think that's typical of her work. Anyway, onwards.
I want to mention to people that it's not only a poem, it's also a short story.
Yes.
in
Yeah.
two forms.
Yes.
And of course, it's her discovering herself, which is what's so fascinating. This was placed in Worcester, where when she was Aunt Consuela is one of her unfavored aunts on her father's side.
A weak and timid woman.
Yeah.
That's right.
She never spoke that way about any of her mothers.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, that's very interesting.
Onwards.
And also, the New Yorker published it, by the way, in much later, of course. You know, it mentions breast and all kinds of things that
Oh, that's
back in
true.
the-
Yes. Right.
they
Right.
wouldn't-
Might have been considered too sexy.
Yeah, that's right. I suspect so.
I think that line, "I was one of them,"
I was
Yes,
one of them.
yes.
it's, wow, it just knocks me out.
By which he means both. I'm also human, but also I'm also a woman. You could very
Yes.
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 Gender.
Both. Both.
little-
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think Akuchi is next.
Yes,
It
yes,
is.
it is.
Coochie.
And hello again, Mia. And moving from the cold and gray of Massachusetts back to Key West is a poem written by Elizabeth. And Coochie is an elegy written by Elizabeth Bishop for the Black servant Coochie of Miss Lula, the boarding house owner where Bishop and Louise Crane lived in 1938 here in Key West. The marl referred to in Coochie is a whitish gray rock, which is very, very typical of here in the lower Florida Keys. And the lower Keys basically extend from Big Pine down here to Key West, and the upper Keys are considered northward. But back to Key West. Coochie. Coochie, Miss Lula's servant, lies in marl. Black and white she went, below the surface of the coral reef. Her life was spent in caring for Miss Lula, who is deaf, eating her dinner off the kitchen sink, while Lula ate hers off the kitchen table. The skies were egg white for the funeral, and the faces sable. Tonight, the moonlight will alleviate the melting of the pink wax roses planted in tin cans filled with sand, placed in a line to mark Miss Lula's losses. But who will shout and make her understand? Searching the land and sea for someone else, the lighthouse will discover Coochie's grave and dismiss all as trivial. The sea, desperate, will proffer wave after wave. And it's a beautiful poem. And again, the mention of the lighthouse. So many lighthouses here in the Keys.
Yeah, there is indeed a lighthouse in Key West, right? Which was probably closer to the sea. And I have a feeling the town was built out some since that poem was written.
There's so much in the poem that can be taken.
We are having freeze ups. We've got some real
Here we go.
connectivity
Yeah, a little
issues.
bit of a yeah.
This seems to be the worst. It's absolutely frozen solid.
There we go.
Drowned herself in the ocean, and that's why her body is under, the words are. In any case, other information about the poem.
And it's also, of course, a reflection of her understanding of where blacks and whites stood in Key West. This is very clear class and race distinctions, of which she was quite aware. Didn't do anything about it, but she could.
Yeah, the kitchen table versus the sink
Mhm.
tells you a world of stuff. That's a world of information right there.
Mhm.
Yep.
Well, and the line, the skies were egg white for the funeral, and the face is sable.
Yes.
Yeah, basically, the statement, that was a statement that there were very few white people, including Miss Lula, who
Right,
attended,
yes,
who
yes,
did
yes.
not attend Coochie's funeral.
Yeah.
Well, on the next with Sandpiper, another, shall we say, another marine poem. This one I think was written, let's see, I think it was written in Brazil. No, yes, it was written in Brazil, but it's about a Massachusetts coastline, of which she wrote several poems, beautiful ones. This is called Sandpiper. And by the way, consider that it's also a poem about Elizabeth Bishop. The roaring alongside he takes for granted, and that every so often the world is bound to shake. He runs to the south, pinnacle, awkward, in a state of controlled panic, a student of Blake. The beach hisses like fat. On his left, a sheet of interrupting water comes and goes and glazes over his dark and brittle feet. He runs straight through it, watching his toes. Watching, rather, the spaces of sand between them, where no detail too small, the Atlantic drains rapidly backwards and downwards. As he runs, he stares at the dragging grains. The world is a mist, and then the world is minute and vast and clear. The tide is higher or lower. He couldn't tell you which. His beak is focused. He is preoccupied, looking for something. Poor bird, he is obsessed. The millions of grains are black, white, tan, and gray, mixed with quartz grains, rose, and amethyst. That's it.
Sandpiper. Oh, yes.
Now comes filling station.
We're probably back in Nova Scotia for this one.
Well, maybe, but it's also Brazil.
It depends on, well, it belongs to a part of a volume called Elsewhere.
Yeah.
And the first part of the volume is Brazil. So I think this must be Nova Scotia or somewhere in the States. Filling station is what people often call gas stations or service stations in the 1950s. This one, the one this poem describes, was probably in Nova Scotia, and it was, as you'll hear, an Esso station. Oh, but it is dirty, this little filling station. Oil-soaked, oil permeated to a disturbing, overall black translucency. Be careful with that match. Father wears a dirty, oil-soaked monkey suit that cuts him under the arms, and several quick and saucy and greasy sons assist him. It's a family filling station, all quite thoroughly dirty. Do they live in the station? It has a cement porch behind the pumps, and on it a set of crushed and grease-impregnated wicker work. On the wicker sofa, a dirty dog, quite comfy. Some comic books provide the only note of color, of certain color. They lie upon a big dim doily, draping a tabaret, part of the set, beside a big hirsute begonia. Why the extraneous plant? Why the tabaret? Why, oh, why the doily? Embroidered in daisy stitch with marguerites, I think, and heavy with gray crochet. Somebody embroidered the doily. Somebody waters the plant, or oils it, maybe. Somebody arranges the rows of cans so that they softly say, Esso, so, to high-strung automobiles. Somebody loves us all. a very
We're
funny.
not doing great on time. It's already 48 minutes. So.
Oh, well. Onwards then. North Haven.
North Haven. This is a poem that was written by Elizabeth Bishop in memoriam to Robert Lowell. She was very good friends with Robert Lowell throughout his life. It starts out, I can make out the rigging of a schooner a mile off. I can count the new cones on the spruce. It is so still. The pale bay wears a milky skin. The sky no clouds except for one long carded horse's tail. The islands haven't shifted since last summer, even if I like to pretend they have. Drifting in a dreamy sort of way, a little north, a little south, or sidewise. And that they are free within the blue frontiers of bay. This month, the favorite one is full of flowers. Buttercups, red clover, purple vetch, hawkweed still burning, Nazy's pie, eyebright, the fragrant bedstraws, incandescent stars, and more return to paint the meadows with delight. The goldfinches are back, or others like them, and the white-throated sparrows, five-note song, pleading and pleading, bring tears to the eyes. Nature repeats herself, or almost does. Repeat, 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 revise, revise, revise. Years ago, you told me it was here in 1932 you first discovered girls and learned to sail and learned to kiss. You had such fun, you said, that classic summer. Fun. It always seemed to leave you at a loss. You left North Haven anchored in its rock, afloat in mystic blue. And now you've left for good. You can't derange or rearrange your poems again, but the sparrows can sing their songs. The words won't change. Sad friend, you cannot change.
Such a lovely elegy.
Mm.
So lovely. At this point, I'm going to read to you One Art. One Art is a villanelle, and many people feel as if it's a summation of Bishop's life. It is a late poem, and if you know a lot about her life, there are things in this poem that are very, very clearly
Okay.
her life. In any case, a villanelle is a poem that has very strong internal rhymes and repeated lines as well, as again you'll see very fast. One Art. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost, that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, faces and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last, or next to last, of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster. Some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster.
Ended happily. Her partner did not leave her.
Right. Right.
Many people read it as if it has to do with the death of Lotte, but We now know that it was really that her current and last lover, the one who ended up as the executor of her estate, was contemplating the possibility of marrying a man, and this was quite threatening. However, she did not choose to follow through on that and stayed with Bishop until and after Bishop's death.
Which was quite sudden. I mean, she had an aneurysm in the brain. She collapsed in her apartment. She was alone. She was giving a party, and it was canceled. They all gathered and commiserated. But anyhow,
It's strange that both Lowell and Bishop died in this absolutely sudden manner. Riding back in a cab from the airport, just dead. She falling down in her apartment, dead.
Yeah.
Very strangely, and neither of them really of an age to die. They were both pretty young.
Yeah, they were in their 60s.
She was 69.
Yeah.
So in any case, that's a very interesting part of how her life ended and how it related to how his ended.
The thing that strikes me about Bishop's work, and I find this with increasingly each time I reread a piece, a poem which might initially sound or seem just sort of, ordinary, rather low key, even a little bland. When you look at it again and again, and you come back to it, it becomes very powerful. And it's very strange that happens. There's one poem of hers called Poem that I cannot read aloud because every time I try to read it aloud, I break down in tears.
Yeah. Thank you, Roseanne. Thank you, Bill. We hope you've enjoyed this sample of Elizabeth Bishop's poems and that you can go and read these and her many others, not so many, which is the nice part about it. And you can read them aloud if you want to. And if you're in Key West next February the 8th, do come to Elizabeth Bishop's 112th birthday. You can contact me at Malcolm R.W., that's MALCOLMRW 2013 at hotmail.com. And her house will be perhaps open. This is a picture of it. It's an eyebrow house, and which means there's little windows up high and just cutely looking down. Anyway, the bill is going to conclude.
Well, I don't have a lot to conclude, really, except to say that it's been a great pleasure reading these poems aloud, and I hope that you all have enjoyed hearing them as much as we have enjoyed reading them. We are a group who have met, as I said at the start, early on, for the express purpose of reading Bishop's poems and talking about them. And we have found it an extraordinarily rewarding thing to do. And I want to thank Malcolm for introducing us to these poems by introducing us to this event, the annual birthday. And I also want to thank Victor Urbanowitz for introducing me to this poetry series and essentially initiating, without knowing it, this collection of readings of Elizabeth Bishop. So thank you, Victor, and thank you all, fellow readers.
It's been a pleasure. It has. Yes.
And thank your listeners, too.
I trust that the listeners will have gotten some pleasure out of this. I certainly hope so. And thank you, Fran.
Buy a book and read it.
Buy the book. Buy one of our books and read it. That's right. Buy the collected poems. You can't go wrong.
Library of America. And I put in
All America is a good one to get.
Thank
and I
you.
think we have now concluded our hour.
Thank you.
There, I think I see Frank. Hello, Frank.
Hello, and
You have
boy,
shot on hard.
you did a wonderful job, and I'm so grateful. And I am so impressed because you actually used my minute too. So here we go.
I stole your minute from you, did we? Oh,
You
dear.
did. Oh, here I go off into the stratosphere, lifted up on your poems and your wonderful recitations.
Well, thank you.
We'll look forward to next year.
Thank you.